Last time I met Guy Michelmore, it was about 6:30 in the morning, and I have to admit we were on a sofa. And before you rushed to the newspapers to reveal that, it was actually on BBC Breakfast News, because Guy and I were actually doing breakfast news back then in the 1990s, and then Newsroom South East. But I wanted to bring him in because actually, back then I had no idea he was a bird watcher, nor did I know he was a composer. In fact, he's written the music scores for dozens of successful films and TV programs. But today, he's going to go back into his former role as a master interrogator to run our panel debate. Please welcome Guy Michelmore.
Introduce the rest of the panel. We've already met Debbie just a moment ago. Chris Packham started the day off. Let's bring him up on the stage. Pete Durnell, you too. And somebody we haven't met yet, Andy Page, who is Head of Wildlife Management at Forestry England. So, okay, great stuff. Now, we heard first thing this morning from Chris talking very passionately about the power of our young members. So what we thought we'd do before we got into the questions from the rest of the audience was listen to some of the questions specifically from our young members.
I've been really lucky to grow up in a family who have taken me on walks out in nature, have allowed me to ask questions and explore and get muddy. But many young people don't have these opportunities or aren't in a place where they can look for wildlife. And so how would you educate more people, especially parents and teachers, to allow more young people to engage with nature?
Hello, my name is Debbie. I'm a new member at HOS, and my question for HOS today is it a promising sign that southern European birds are coming to breed more often in the UK, or is it just a threatening sign that climate change is ever closer? Bye.
We've had good reports that less spotted woodpeckers are doing well in the New Forest. If so, what is the percentage increase?
Hello, my name is Sid, and me and my family often go to the Isle of Wight. We see that the sewage gets pumped into the ocean, and I was wondering how this affects the birds around us and if they're planning to stop it.
What great questions. Really, really good. Thank you very much indeed to all of those who sent in their questions. Let me start, first of all, with Amy's question. Debbie, let me put this one to you. How would you educate parents and teachers to allow more young people to engage with nature?
Yeah, great question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Is this on? Yeah. Education is one of our charitable objectives, always has been. We used to do a lot of education where kids would come out to the countryside. We still do a lot of that. But actually what we found in a way that's more effective is going out to schools and working with communities as well. Because you don't want, nature connection to be, you have to get on a coach to do it. It's a cost, but also it sort of reinforces that separation. So we do a lot more work where we do train the trainer, we're doing forest schools, we're doing teacher training, and we're doing a lot of stuff with schools, but also with communities too.
Can it work the other way around? Should the young people be educating the parents and the teachers?
Well, they do. They absolutely
Exactly.
do. Yeah. Because now in school, of course, they're learning much more about all of this. So it works that way too.
And we've seen how passionate and committed they are. Exactly.
Yeah.
Sebi's question. Let's go on to this. Is it a promising sign that southern European birds are breeding here now, or is it just the threat that climate change is getting worse? Pete, what about that?
Well, probably a bit of both, to be honest. I mean, it's interesting. Some of the species I mentioned in my talk, things like great white egrets, cattle egrets, avocets. These are birds that were Mediterranean species, really, that are now breeding in this country. But some of it is climate change, and probably the climate is more amenable to them now, so they can survive here much easier than they could in the past. But a lot of it actually is down to conservation work as well, conservation efforts. The RSPB, the amount of work they've done around avocets over the years, from that first pair on Havagate Island all those years ago. I mean, that's one of the reasons avocets are doing so well. The climate's better, but they've got brilliant reserves to breed on now. Same with, they've done so much work down in Somerset on the levels down there, and so the herons are taking advantage of that habitat. that wasn't there before, not as good anyway. So I think it's a bit of both. It is climate, but it's also good habitat management as well.
It's not just positive thing. I was really surprised to see that there were red-backed shrike back in the 60s breeding in the UK. I didn't know that. And so we've lost that. So it's habitat as well as habitat loss on the one hand and climate change on the other make a complicated picture.
It does make a complicated picture. Because red-backed shrikes will nest in any crappy bit of scrub, really. You go into Europe and they're all over the place. But they died out in this country.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone's entirely sure why that is. I mean, in theory, a warming climate should make the habitat more suitable for birds like red-backed shrikes and wrynecks. You know, it'd be great if we got wrynecks back in the country. It could be lack of insects. I mean, probably intensive farming doesn't help, but there's plenty of sites around where, there's scrub with insects they could possibly survive. But maybe they will make a comeback. But it is complicated. I think there's an easy answer.
Zach is a big fan of the lesser spotted woodpeckers. Hampshire's one of their great reserves. Andy, are they doing better? And if they are doing better, by how much?
Well, he couldn't have picked a worse bird to get information on the lesser spotted woodpecker. It's extremely difficult to survey and to find and to gather data on. But in a word, maybe not. I mean, I don't necessarily say I see any more lesser spots than I did 35 years ago. I think we're much more aware of them now. We've got more people out there looking. Ken has done a lot of good work with Rob to get surveys done. So we know that the New Forest is a really good place for lesser spots. However, some of the small sample we've looked at with nest cameras, they're not that productive. They seem to be struggling with finding food on some of the pairs, which are not usually good indicators for a growing population. So that's all I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
They weren't there at Acres Down when I went last weekend at 7 o'clock in the morning, unfortunately. They were there 15 minutes before. Doesn't that sound familiar? Yeah, exactly. Sid was hitting on the question that, as you said, 60% of voters care about, and that's sewage being pumped into the sea. And how is it affecting birds? And if so, how can we stop it? Chris?
Well, sewage going into any of our freshwater or marine environment is going to have a negative impact not just on birds, because they're at a certain point higher up the food chain, but the eutrophication, i.e. the enrichment of nutrients which sewage or agricultural runoff, and we mustn't forget that that's equally important. There's a big focus on sewage at the moment, but there's a hell of a lot of nastiness being washed off of those fields in this heavy rain. And essentially it starts at the bottom of the food chain, so you get algae grown, as Debbie pointed out in her slide. Algae can be overwhelming. Obviously, if it's in water, it takes up an enormous amount of oxygen, so your freshwater environment becomes less oxygenated. That's not great for marine animals or freshwater animals that are living in it. And so the impact of this enrichment of nutrients is bad. And of course, when you get to things like sewage, you've got to think that there are other issues, because sewage is essentially being the things that we pass through ourselves, and we pass through a lot of things in ourselves that we didn't ought to be passing on. And these include hormones, other chemicals, so on and so forth. So sewage isn't just enrichment, it's also serious pollution, it's full of toxins.
Is there a solution? I mean, we are in an election year. Can you see anything on the horizon that gives you hope?
Right. So this week I was at Fullerton with Mr. Fergal Sharkey, and I was interviewing him, and every time I asked him a question, he said, "Chris, it's worse than that." Which I may entitle the interview by that. The situation is dire. We've been taken to the cleaners by the water company. We've had a regulator that hasn't regulated, and we've had a monitoring system, the Environment Agency, which we have to engender a small amount of sympathy towards, because we have stood by while successive governments have cut their spending by significant amounts, and therefore they haven't had the people on the ground. They have a demoralised staff, and they've had a very poor board, one would argue. So it's a rich cocktail of failure, which leaves us in a diabolical, shitty mess. The problem is we're not going to get our money back. And at the moment, when you look at what's happening to Thames Water, who have just yesterday defaulted on the parent company of Thames Water has defaulted on their debt. Yeah. We've got to look at now who owns these companies, and therefore where that money is. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the ownership is overseas. And we're looking at the Qatari government, we're looking at the Chinese government, we're looking at the Saudi government. These are the people that own our water companies. And frankly, as Fergal said to me, he doesn't imagine that the Chinese government even know that they own a significant part of southern water, let alone care about it. So we are in deep trouble here. And I think that the only thing we can do at this point is exactly what Debbie said, and that is that 60% of people care about this because it impacts their life in some way, shape or form. It may not be wildlife. It could be that they swim or they canoe or they sailboard. It could be the fact that they are threatened by this type of pollution. So what we should be doing as conservationists is mobilising those people to make sure that we vote for a positive change, and unfortunately that's going to mean public spending.
Let's move on to... the biggest question before all of us at the moment, climate change. Let's take some of the questions which have been emailed in. Amy Robjohn says, given the need to rapidly halve emissions by 2030 to reduce the impact of worsening climate change, why aren't conservation organisations and local councils raising the alarm more and taking action? Emissions are rising, not dropping, and even renewable energy infrastructure requires fossil fuels to produce them. Chris.
Right.
There you go.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is, before we start picking on the councils and the ENGOs, I think we should draw attention to the fact that was raised earlier by this gentleman here. And I could embarrass you all by asking you to take your credit cards or your bank cards out of your wallet and hold them up. Here, here. Because you have within your pocket the ability to significantly impact the investment of fossil fuels, because the big 6 banks, including Lloyds in this country, are still heavily invested, not in keeping business as usual, but actually advancing more fossil fuel usage. And they're also heavily involved in the weapons industry as well. So you could spend 10 minutes downloading the Triodos app and copying your current account over to that. That's how long it takes to do that on your phone, and it copies over all of your direct debits, all of your other banking details, just like that. So until we empower ourselves to make a difference, it's difficult to stand up and start criticising other people. I think recovery starts at home. It starts in your fridges and what you eat, and it starts in your wallet and how you spend it. And from that point onwards, then we may manifest the cheek and audacity to criticise our councils. Well, let's think about that. Underfunded, depopulated in terms of the skill and expertise that we had, even in recent times. And people attest to this. I mean, we can remember when we first met that Hampshire County Council and all of our local councils had biodiversity officers. They were significantly investing in that. But you and I know that they don't have the resources now to keep the schools warm, fixed up, and the teachers properly paid, etc., etc. We're in a cost of living crisis as well. And when it comes to the ENGOs, yeah, I do think that they collectively should be standing together and shouting more loudly. But it's not easy. Debbie's got a budget of £3.5 million that she's got to secure every single year to keep those nature reserves in tip-top condition, because otherwise they will decline.
Let's leave that for a moment, because we're going to come back to it in more detail a little bit later on. And it's a big question which I think we need to dive into in more detail. You mentioned... there is a sort of an upside in some respects to seeing more birds coming to Britain from Southern Europe. Pat Bourne wanted to know, what birds might we see in Britain as it gets warmer and wetter? Pete, what's on your crystal ball? What would you like to see?
Well, I mean, they've almost started doing it now, but who wouldn't mind having parties of bee-eaters in Hampshire, you know? Yeah. Be a rather nice bird to see, wouldn't it? So bee-eaters, I think, is one that may well... They're breeding in Brittany, not far away, in a golf course, actually, in one of the bunkers.
Glossy ibis?
Glossy ibis, again, it's sort of almost here, isn't it? I'll tell you a bird I'd like to see here. You know, I was talking about all these herons that have colonised. I'd like to see purple heron. Yeah. I love purple herons. They're my favourite heron. In Europe, anyway.
And the egrets have done well.
The egrets have done well, so why hasn't purple? And purple heron's tried it a few times at Minsmere, but they've never really stuck around. So that would be great. Purple heron. I mean,
golden
redback shrike, golden
oriole.
Yeah. Birds that we've lost actually. Redback shrike, wryneck, golden oriole. It'd be nice to get them back.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not far away.
Wouldn't it be nice to have, flocks of bee-eaters in Tesco car park? Yeah, bring it on.
Yeah, okay. But hold on, I just got in to see. We're in Hampshire here on the south coast. We want to welcome all of these migrants from across the Channel. If you're living in Scotland, you're not quite so happy about your ptarmigans, your redneck phalaropes, and your caper cayley. So there are winners if you consider that winning. But the fact of the matter is that climate breakdown is adding more of a negative impact on our bird fauna than the possible pin-up of a purple heron.
tells us
I
a
was
lot
asked
about your
that,
youth,
know,
that
what's
a pin-up
coming
is a
in.
purple heron. That's good.
There definitely are losers.
Okay, well, on that subject, Alison Cross wants to know what steps are panel members taking to reduce their individual carbon footprints, and can ecotourism involving flights ever be justified? Debbie.
So I've been a vegetarian forever, since I was 14 years old. I'm vegan now. I drive an electric car. I don't fly really anymore. So I'm trying to do as much as I can. Obviously, bank with Triodos, all that stuff, because as Chris says, that individual, I don't want to stand up here being a hypocrite, so I'll do it as much as I can. But I do support local food and farming. I buy my vegetables locally. I support Riverford. I just do as much as I can.
You.
Well, both my wife and my daughter are vegetarian, so I'm a vegetarian by de facto most of the time, so that's good. That's a good thing. But I can't say I'm as far down the road as Debbie, but I must admit, I might go for Trudolf's Bank. Actually, that is definitely sounds like it. Yeah.
Andy?
My footprint.
Yeah, well, your footprint?
I'll ask Keith to answer this one. Probably not very good in that area, if I'm being honest with you.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we can all improve. I mean, everybody can do, but also everybody in this room who takes part in surveys contributes to citizen science, and it's the science which is going to underpin policy. So that, in its way, is a huge contribution as well, isn't it? Yeah. And we've already heard from, Chris, go on.
I think the one thing is that we didn't ought to see these things as problems. We should see them as opportunities. Changing your bank is not a problem. It's an opportunity for you to do something positive. And it's the way that we frame that in our mind. We are going to have to make lots of changes. We saw the sea level rise. If you're planning on being alive in 2050, right, are you going to be living in Portsmouth? Well, you might, in a houseboat. But that means a change. You're going to move out of a house which is currently rooted and founded on the ground into a houseboat. We're going to have to live with those changes. So we can frame that two ways in our mind. Oh God, this is going to be difficult. What a terrible problem. Or let's take advantage of this and see it as an opportunity.
Andy, question from Geraint Jones, which is definitely coming your way, I think. How does the panel see the future of ancient trees, especially in the New Forest, and the advancement of climate change, grazing pressures being secured if there is no proper wood management to allow the maturing of deciduous species?
Well, yeah, good question. I think this is taxing the brains of a lot of people at the moment. The future for all our trees and woodlands is far from certain. Climate change, pests and diseases are on the increase significantly. Deer numbers are almost out of control. Squirrels, historically the trees in the forest, those ancient trees we look at, they would not have had grey squirrels when they were young. So all these are challenges going forward. Just in my short time, we've seen the wholesale loss of elms, ash trees, larch and pines from disease. So these are trees we're losing out of the landscape. Climate change predictions make it hard to see what future trees we should plant if you're looking at it from a forestry perspective. We're still moving these tree species around the globe without really knowing the impacts of that sometimes. What also, we're getting wetter and warmer winters. This winter particularly wet. We've had many more storms. We're losing a lot of those old veteran trees. It takes a long time to replace those trees. It's a lot of investment. There's a lot of protection needed against those pests and deer and squirrels. And it's really the economics don't stack up against that. So there's some real big challenges out there.
And any hope on the horizon? I mean, what one thing could people do, or could government do, to try and help?
I think sometimes we're arrogant that we try to predict what's going to be coming down the line, and nature seems to be able to resolve that for us a lot of the time. It adapts quite quickly. It takes advantage of opportunities, and I think if we were a little bit more relaxed about seeing what happens and what takes its place rather than trying to predict, we might not be in such a state.
Let me take a question from Kevin Sayer. I suspect some of you in the room, if you are, just feel free to put your hand up. But he wants to know about recent studies have shown that foxes predate many wadder nests in both the Avon Valley and the New Forest. Shooting of foxes is carried out by gamekeepers in the Avon Valley to control their numbers. Should we be looking at controlling fox numbers in the New Forest too, Andy?
Well, in short, we already are. I'm aware that the killing, or management as I prefer to call it, of any species, particularly in the name of helping another, is an emotive and controversial subject, where we have seen significant declines in our important curlew populations, and it's now a red-listed species of critical conservation concern. Should we just accept their loss, or should we try to understand some of the reasons for their losses and maybe turn around their fortunes? Now, I, for one, didn't want to see the loss of curlew from the forest. It's an iconic species on my watch, and if there was something we could do to investigate and look at that further, then I was prepared to do it. So we started looking at this about 2014-15, when we noticed this big decline, and many said it would be dogs and recreational disturbance, others said it would be predation, some said climate change or habitat loss, and in truth it's probably a combination of all of those things. But as I said, I didn't want to see these go, so I was quite keen that we started something that was science-based, and we took it through in a progression. So in those early years, we put data loggers in nests to see whether human disturbance was moving the birds off the nest more frequently. We're getting failures from that. We were very lucky to have Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust and Bournemouth University fund a PhD student who's been working tirelessly on that for the last few years. We've progressed that to putting nest cameras on curlew nests, curlew nests, to see what the losses were happening and why, and what the main predators were. And it came out overwhelmingly that the losses were down to foxes. Not only foxes, but probably 60+% of egg losses were down to foxes. Now that's significant. It was obviously a major factor in why the recruitment's poor and it was something we could actually do something about that. Right. So we have, in the last 3 years, been doing targeted fox and crow control in key areas for curlews.
Chris, I know you've spoken passionately about defending foxes in the past. How would you square this circle? Because there's scientific evidence that they're damaging the recovery of a really imperiled bird.
Yeah, well, you picked on the nation's #1 fox fan. But I can't disagree with anything that Andy has just said. We have to take pragmatic decisions in times of crisis, and with a plummeting population of curlews, then the targeted elimination of those predators, for us to maintain that mosaic of habitat and species is an unfortunate aspect, as is the culling of deer, which we already touched upon. The fact is that we live in a manscape, and if we want to manage that manscape to the best that we possibly can at that time, given the resources that we've got, then unfortunately we have to take those steps. I'm very fortunate that I can hear curlews from my garden, but I've never had a fox on my trap cameras in the garden. And that, unfortunately, is currently the cost of conservation, and I support it.
Okay, well done. Keith Godfrey wanted to know, much of the New Forest heathlands and woodlands suffer from overgrazing by high numbers of ponies, cattle and deer, such that they are in poor condition for birds, flowers and other wildlife. While recognising that this is an emotive topic, is there anything that can be done to give wildlife higher priority in their management? Andy, this is another one for you. Sorry, they're coming.
So glad.
We'll just bowl a couple more your way.
You can't take that away from me. Well, I know that view of overgrazing is a view held by many, but I could equally, I know, and I would sit half in your cat, but I could equally wheel out many eminent county naturalists who would say different, including those from Natural England, who are the government's conservation body. So differing levels of grazing create diverse mosaics of habitats across the forest. And some species will benefit from that and some won't, but that's that natural cycle of the forest. We have a big enough landscape that generally it can cope with that. I think we need to look at the drivers behind why that is. You look at woodlarks, for instance, you looked at the numbers on the northern heaths, very, very poor. They've got no grazing up there. They've got no curlews up there. We've got them on the forest because of that heavy grazing. Some of our rarest plants are found in the New Forest. So it depends how you look. If you look at it in the whole, and you look at the whole cycle through forest life, those grazing animals are integral to why it's out there. In truth, we cannot monitor enough species for a long enough period to know the effects that those different grazing pressures have on all of those things. All we can do is the same with our management, with our burning and other things, that we know if we do some over the whole of the forest on a little and often basis, that we can cope with all those populations still remaining relatively stable. But there'll always be things that go up and down due to those grazing pressures. Now, the drivers behind that are subsidies, and it's the government as part of the farmers' subsidy which has driven those stock levels up. Now, it's one of those things that people might not know is that actually, although Forestry England manage all of the Crown Lands and New Forest, the right to put your pasture, your animals out there is nothing to do with us whatsoever, and we have no say in that. It's a right that's enshrined in law, so people have a right by law to put those animals out there, and we can't say we want less or more out there. It's nothing to do with us, unfortunately. All we can do is monitor the impacts and try to understand what that right level should be.
Is the problem, when it comes down to it, that areas like the New Forest are so unusual because they're so precious? We're asking it to do three things at once. It's a place where people graze, it's a place of recreational activity for people, and it's a place which is actually vital to wildlife conservation. Yeah. And we're asking it to do too many things at the same time. I mean, Debbie, this is what you're finding?
I was going to add, actually, that you know, we have a place called Roydon Woods, privately owned by the Trust, 1,000 acres, and we deliberately manage that in a much less, like a low-intensity way, low levels of grazing, and as a result, adds to the diversity of the overall forest. So very different habitats there, you know, much more ground flora, different wildlife assemblages, and we deliberately manage it that way, and it's quiet. You know, we don't shout about it, the visitor numbers are less, and so that provides a sort of bit of a sanctuary, really, for some of the wildlife that struggles on the open forest. But you're right.
I mean, we talk about the grazing animals, but Chris quite knows that the deer population in the UK has gone through the roof, and the numbers of deer in the forest, so they're all eating something out there. So we're doing our best. We're probably shooting 3 times as many deer now as we were 20 years ago, and it's never ending. I don't know what they're becoming, unfortunately. I hate to say this, but they're becoming the new rabbits. So how people viewed rabbits in the 50s, we're now viewing deer in the same way.
Venison.
Eat venison.
Yeah. Well, we've had this conversation.
Bring back wolves and lynx.
Yeah, absolutely. A question about dogs. Now, I know how emotive this is. We've heard about it already today. Checha Jones says, our family has had dogs and I'm not anti-dog. I'm thoroughly applaud the New Forest authorities for closing many car parks during the bird nesting period. Rather than discreet dogs on leads notices at Farlington and Keyhaven and so on, I'd like to see large signs at all entry points explaining why dogs need to be on leads. Pete, you've dealt with this problem. Where would you... Okay, Pete.
Okay, I mean, we did touch on this earlier on, actually. We had a question about this earlier, didn't we, after the talk. As I said earlier on, I mean, dogs are an emotive issue, but they're probably not as serious an issue as people think they are. I mean, it's foxes that are causing the majority of the problems for our ground nesting birds. And going on to signage, I'm not convinced people who don't really want to read a sign will read a sign if it's 10 times bigger than it is if it's relatively small and discreet. People know. If you own a dog, you know how you should behave. 95% of people know. Some people choose not to. Some people choose to be awkward. And that, unfortunately, it's a relatively small percentage. Maybe only 1% of dog owners. But as I say, if we've got 100,000 dogs appearing on Lymington Key Notices every year, that's 1,000 dogs that are doing things that they shouldn't. And that does wind people up, I know. But it's probably not causing as much damage.
Debbie.
Okay, I'm going to make an announcement. I was waiting for this moment. We have just changed our policy at the Wildlife Trust, and we are going to enforce a dogs on leads policy across our entire... Good luck. I'm sure that not everybody will do it, and it will be difficult, but we're rolling out signs, we're rolling out a programme of education. We're probably going to need lots of volunteers to help. People will not necessarily do it, but we're going to try our damnedest, and it's dogs on leads. These are nature reserves, they're not parks, and as part of it as well, and going back to things like planning and development, you know, we really need to make sure that local authorities are providing more green space, because that's also part of the issue. So, bit of a focus for us in the coming couple of years.
Is there a danger that one starts alienating parts of the population who are not, like us in this room, passionate about wildlife, but enjoy the outside space, and whose votes we need in order to get progress?
In our experience, not really. You know, as Pete says, actually, most people are perfectly fine when you say, this is a nature reserve, would you mind keeping your dog on a lead? And it's really about that education piece. People don't necessarily understand and know, and it's absolutely fine for them to be there. but it's a nature reserve.
I think
it's not a park.
It's vitally important that, as Debbie said, and it's in your strategy, that we provide alternative green spaces for dogs and people to walk their dogs. Make them exciting, put tyres and they jump through them, all this sort of stuff. Charge them, and the county are thinking about this. We have actually put several dog fields in place and we're looking at several others. One potentially up at Crab Wood, because we get a lot of issues around dogs at pit. Put a dog field with lots of dog bins, safe place, lots of fences around the outside. You can do whatever you want to your dog. Much better. And so it is moving in that direction, but it's a long, slow...
And work with responsible dog owners. We have some great, responsible dog owners that do cattle lookering, that do volunteering, and they're real great ambassadors for the right...
Well, many of us, how many people, show of hands, how many people own a dog? Yeah, exactly. You're a lifelong dog owner, I'm a lifelong dog owner. How do you feel about this issue?
I've always felt passionately that dogs should be either not on nature reserves or on leads. Research in the Netherlands has shown that even when dogs are on leads, they can have an impact on breeding bird success. But I would, more than applaud Debbie for taking that bold and brave step. But then I agree entirely with Pete. The thing is, a bit of stick is good, but a bit of carrot can also help. And I've often thought that in the New Forest, if we had centralised dog walking areas where we provided resources for people, particularly for those dogs, so perhaps undercover areas where they can stand and talk about their dogs to one another, which they love doing, when it's constantly pouring with rain, where the car parks are maintained so that they're not all muddy, where there's grey water available where they can wash their dogs down so that they don't have to put the mud from the New Forest on their carpets when they get home, where there are bins provided, and where, as you said, there are exercise areas, things which dog people like. And a lot of people do use their dogs, not me, but as a means of socialising. I'm the most antisocial person with the most antisocial dogs. But the key thing is that a lot of people do, and it's very much a social thing. So a few hotspots near to the cities, Southampton, and then you've got Salisbury in the north, you've got Bournemouth and Poole in the south, hotspots where people could go, where the facilities were better, and a lot of the pressure would be taken off because people would naturally gravitate to those places.
I think that's entirely true.
And just one final point, the county's realised that actually there's money to be made out of dog washing. And, they've installed these dog washing things at Keighley Country Park and I think possibly at Manor Farm, and they make a fortune. People love washing their dog. Fine. Got to have a hobby.
Related question from Janice Beck. We're hearing that reports that veterinary products used on dogs for the treatment of fleas and ticks is the in freshwater ponds in the New Forest is causing harm. And she's worried about how this is going to affect scarce breeding birds like curlew. As a dog owner and myself, what should be done? Chris?
Okay, so what we're looking at here are basically a group of chemicals which are included in most of the spot-on treatments that people put on their dogs to keep fleas and particularly ticks away. As a New Forest resident and dog owner, I cannot not treat my dogs for ticks because the tick population is large and it's growing, and the percentage of those ticks infected with Lyme disease, which can infect dogs, is very high. My means of dealing with that is not using spot-ons, and I've trained my poodles, who I also call mud sponges, to not go in the water, so they don't ever enter the water. And on that account, I've minimised the potential of those chemicals entering the freshwater chain. So I think, again, it's an education thing. The spot-on treatments work. Is it appropriate for you to use that treatment if you're going to exercise your dog in an area in a national park, and your dog is, by its very nature, a dog that likes to enter the water? So I think we run an education campaign saying there are alternatives. You don't have to use these. There are tablets that you can give your dog, so therefore it's all internal, except for the fact that you've got canine excrement and wee. And that is another thing that was studied in the New Forest some time ago as an extensive report. And the fact is, as we were saying earlier, people think the New Forest is some great big soak and you can allow your dog to poo there and it won't matter. You should be picking up your dog poo and taking it home for that, if not other reasons. And as Pete was saying, I think Andy was saying earlier, the other thing is that the foxes eat the dog poo, and we're trying to minimise the number of foxes because of the curlews. So, so can you please poop and scoop when you walk your dog in the New Forest and keep it on a lead?
Dave Goulson at Sussex is doing lots of research together with Imperial, and they're discovering that it's not just the dogs going into the water, it's actually the treatment getting into your hands and getting into the water system. It's much more, they're related to neonics and things like this.
That's correct,
So, I mean, but there isn't
a really, really effective alternative at the moment, is there?
No, I mean, I was going to mention that study. I was reading it last night. So they're saying that the insecticides, which fipronardix is related in neonicotinoids, they can stay on your hands. If you put it on your animal and then you're stroking it or whatever, it can actually stay on your hands for 28 days. Yeah. So even just washing your hands, it will get into the water supply. So it's more than just keeping your dog out of the pond. So they're pretty toxic. So it's tricky. Alternative treatments, maybe only treating when you need to. I think the problem with these monthly ones is people do it every month anyway. So they're using it sort of all the time, even if you don't need to. So again, it is an education thing.
But that's the spot-ons, isn't it? There are the tablets that you can give
Yeah.
them, which are internal. So
Yes.
I would
So
argue that in
better,
that case,
yeah.
you should gravitate immediately to that. But that's an
Yeah.
education campaign
Yeah,
that we could
it is.
run
Yeah.
to minimise that.
Well,
Yes, exactly.
several hundred people now know, so
Yeah.
that's a good start, a good start. Trevor Griffin wants to know, why do Hampshire Wildlife Trust allow wildfowlers permission to shoot birds on Farlington Marsh? Something I was shocked to have witnessed early one Sunday morning. That's one for you, Debbie.
Let me clear this up. We do not allow people to shoot birds on our nature reserves. That is a misconception. Unfortunately, though, their sporting rights are owned on the mudflats by the Crown Estate.
Yeah.
So they are very historic shooting rights. So Ladwacker, Langstone and District Association, Wildfowling Association do have shooting rights on some of the mudflats. They've been in place for decades, very, very long time. That is nothing to do with the trust. We do not allow it on our land. They are allowed to shoot from the seawall across the mudflats, but they mustn't be on our reserve. They mustn't shoot anywhere across or on our reserve. And if you ever see that, please let us know, because that's not allowed. The other thing I would also say, though, is we have taken out a joint lease with the Ladwacker on some of the other parts of the mudflats, and we don't exercise the shooting rights there. So actually what we've done is create a no-shoot area, which is actually a lot bigger than the shooting area. So we've tried to do what we can to minimise it. It's not something I'm terribly comfortable with, but it is what it is. But it's definitely not something we allow, so that is a misconception.
Okay. Chris Spooner, Pete Durnell, would like an update on what's happening at Titchfield Haven, both the reserve and Haven House. Did I hear a murmur in the hall? I had a murmur in the hall. Okay.
Okay. Well, as I understand it, Haven House has been sold, so that's done and dusted. But I've heard a rumour recently that the new owner might be opening it as a calf. So maybe that'll happen. I don't know, to be honest. But both Haven House and Barry Duffin's old house, the cottage there, have been sold. And again, as I understand it, the income from those sales, which is quite significant, has been ring-fenced for spending on the nature reserve, which is really what the site is about. When I worked at Titchfield many, many years ago, and at the time, Haven House was occupied by a religious sect with a Rolls Royce. With nothing to do with the reserve. It only became part of the reserve later on. So, the reserve is still there, it's still going to be managed, and you could argue that actually they've got some money now to improve the infrastructure, the hides and the boardwalks, things like that, which the county was struggling to pay for. So, yeah, that's, as I understand it, the current situation at Titchfield.
Right, okay. Let's move on. Another question coming your way. It seems that there's little management of the water levels in some of the lagoons favoured by ground nesting birds, such as Fishtail Lagoon. The result is that some of the shingle islands are partially or completely underwater, just at the time these birds are looking for safe nesting places. I've been told that the sluice gates are jammed, but this problem has been going on for years. What's happening?
Okay. Yeah, I feel your pain, because
I tried to inject a little exasperation.
Yeah. So you're right. So Fishtail Lagoon, for those of you who know it, there's an island in the middle of Fishtail Lagoon, and most years we get about 20 pairs of avocets nesting on that island. At the moment, they're sitting around the outside staring at basically a completely flooded island. The reason for this is the sluice at the end of Lower Pennington Stream, which goes through the seawall and takes all the water from Fishtail Lagoon, Butts Lagoon and the Lower Pennington Stream, is completely blocked with about 10 tonnes of gravel and shingle. Now, the seawall and the sluices that go through it are nothing really to do with the County Council. They are Environment Agency structures. They built them, they maintain them, including the sluices. It's not anything to do with the County Council maintaining those sluices. We do, from time to time, clear them. I've asked the lads to go down and pull a load of weed out. That's one thing. Pulling 10 tonnes of shingle out is another matter. And the problem is you dig it out, you put it to one side, Big tide comes in, washes it straight back into the sluice. We've got a real problem.
What is the long-term plan?
Well, the long-term plan really is that sluice is in a very, very bad location. It's in a bay, all the weed and all the gravel ends up blocking that sluice. So, yeah.
Because it's one sluice, but it's a massive area. It's a huge impact on breeding birds.
You're right. It is a serious problem. And I constantly hassle the Environment Agency about this. The guy Arthur, who's the guy who's responsible for this. The problem is, frankly, they've got an awful lot of stuff on their plate. They've got flooding all over the place. Yeah. And the fact that we've got an SAC flooded down at Lymington where there's no property or housing at risk means that is really quite low on their list of priorities. They may get round to it eventually, but whether they get round to it in time for the breeding season, I don't know. But I will continue to hassle them because it needs doing. And the impact is definitely, it is impacting the reserve and the SAC saline lagoons. So, yeah.
Okay, last of the local questions. Keith Metcalf wants to know, her spit has many important designations, but other than Bird Aware Solent and local volunteers, nobody monitors the disturbance to ground nesting birds that breed there. Does the panel agree that her spit, its inner salt marsh islands and declining breeding waders and terns should be better protected there? And would one of the panel like to put their hand up and help us raise disturbance awareness and promote Hurst as a bird sanctuary? Debbie?
Debbie?
In fact, some of it was up for sale recently, wasn't it, I think? But it was unbelievably expensive for something that's, sort of disappearing. But, Pete manages that area. We agree. We work very closely with you. I think you should answer this one.
Okay.
I've got questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so her spit, historically, it did have little tern nesting on it. It hasn't done so for many, many years, certainly since I've been around, 20 odd years down there, because of just the sheer level of visitor pressure. And it's not just people walking down the spit, it's people landing in their boats on the end of the spit. It's a great place to land your boat, get out and have a little picnic and wander around. Unfortunately, that is the exact spot where a lot of species would want to nest. Ring plovers do breed out there successfully, as do oyster catchers, but they have to take their chances, frankly. So I think Keith's initiative, and not just Keith, but the ownership is complex. So it was that section that Debbie referred to was recently bought by 3 wealthy individuals from Keyhaven. The county own bits of it, NFDC own bits of it, English Heritage have got around the area around the castle. So it's a complex.
I have to say, this isn't the first time this afternoon I've heard multiple conflicting interests and no one overall strategy being the real root cause of a lot of the problems. Who's putting the pressure on to sort that out?
Yeah,
You're good at pressure.
It's a good challenge. I'll take it away.
Okay, question deferred.
Put it on the list.
Steve Seagrave, let's move on to another emotive issue, and that's farming. One for you, Chris. How should the government remunerate and reward farmers and landowners for their custody of the land? What drivers would the panel like to see used for this measurement? Big one.
Okay, well, as Debbie highlighted earlier, although I would disagree with one of the words, and that was many, I think that when we say many farmers are doing great things for wildlife, we shouldn't exaggerate the impact that they're having in wildlife recovery. So there may be quite a few if you add them up, but they're not significant in terms of the impact they're having more broadly. So what those farmers are doing is that they are trying and testing techniques where we can farm alongside wildlife. And that includes regenerative farming, organic farming across the spectrum. And there is no doubt whatsoever that they have it within their means and power to do exactly what we would like them to do. But broader farming is not following suit. And it's not following suit because we have essentially the NFU, one of the worst forces in the British landscape, exacting tremendous pressure over DEFRA and basically running the shop. And NFU are funded by big ag, so they're interested in big farmers and large amounts of money, and therefore we're up against serious lobbying. What can we do about that? Well, what we should be doing about that is making sure that we put sufficient pressure on government to make sure that our farmers are properly incentivised with schemes that work for them in particular. And one of the problems that we've got with our higher level stewardship schemes, which are the only ones that work, and even when they do work, it takes you 10 years to get a 2% increase in farmland birds. So we're pouring all of this money into subsidies, but they don't really work. And one of the reasons they don't work is because they're not flexible enough for those farmers to be able to use them on their farms. And that, again, makes life difficult for our farmers. And I do think that if we want our farmers to do things for us, we've got to make life easy. So firstly, let's pay them properly for subsidies that support wildlife. Let's give them the flexibility to do what they're good at, which is farming their land. But let's also make sure that they have real targets which they've got to meet to get those subsidies. I'm fed up with supporting dying industries, okay, which are doing enormous damage to our countryside because they've got the might of the NFU who are bullying DEFRA behind them.
Do you think there's enough education for farmers? I mean, because one of my BBS squares is a very intensively managed farm, and frankly, there's more wildlife in Tesco's car park, which I refer back to, than there is in the middle of that field. And whilst the field itself is, you know, that's their workshop, etc., they are also very keen on tidying up things they don't need to tidy up.
Yeah.
Say, the yellowhammer's gone because you've taken away that bramble which didn't need to be taken away.
Yeah.
Is there a job to be done for education?
They're being paid to tidy up. Let's take away the money and pay them to be untidy. Farmers are good at what they do. They produce food. They grow things. Actually, what they're doing is they're growing life, you know, that we are dependent upon. So I would argue that even the bad farmers are good at growing life. What they need is instruction and proper support to grow it in a way which is sustainable going into our future. And I have every faith that if we gave them the right guidance and the right support and flexibility, that they would move forward with that a lot more rapidly than they are at the moment. But whilst we're still in the grip of big agriculture, which wants more pesticides used, which wants more fertiliser used, which wants bigger fields and bigger yields, then we are in dire trouble.
You were making reference to a couple of farms you've taken on the Isle of Wight. How can we improve our relationship with farmers to get them working on our side?
Yeah, and I think it's a really huge area. I think one other thing that's sorely lacking is regulation again. I mentioned the farming rules for water, which, you know, all farmers are supposed to adhere to, and yet the regulators don't have the resource. You know, we have all sorts of, you know, spreading slurry when it's raining and all of that goes in the river. That shouldn't be happening. The regulators are not equipped to deal with that. And so, you know, you have a sort of younger, new entrant farmers coming in, like some of them that we're working with, who absolutely get it. You know, they've read books like 40 harvests left. They've read books like 6 Inches of Soil and all of that. And they know that the future of their business is in the health of the soils. You know, if soils are dead, you can't grow food. So one thing that gives me heart, I suppose, is if you look at Groundswell, which is the regenerative farming annual conference. When that started, it had just a few hundred farmers going. And I think last year there were about 7,000 or 8,000. That's growing all the time. Yeah. The problem is the numbers of farmers that get it are quite large, but the hectares of land they're farming is small. And so again, it's the big guys versus the little guys. Remember, only about 10 or 20% of farmers are members of the NFU.
Right.
But if you look at the hectares, again, it's the big ag, and that's the big problem.
And in one of your graphics that you showed, Debbie, you showed that farm size in Hampshire is increasing. Yep. So this goes against exactly what that's exactly what we don't want.
Yeah.
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 We want farm size to be stable so that we can work with those farmers and they're not taking into big ag, which is big money, which is big chemicals.
Yeah.
There's one thing. So I was going to say, one thing that people maybe don't realise is that the County Council Estates team, we actually own quite a lot of farms around the county. Relatively small farms usually, but the idea is to get new tenant farmers into the business. This is one of the roles of the estates team. And in the last few years, they've changed the way they select their tenant farmers. So every 7 years, they go back out to offer the tenancy. People will put forward their case. We now ask them, what will you do to increase the biodiversity on your farm? What can you say? We asked them to make a presentation now saying what they will do with this piece of land to improve it during the 7 years of their tenure. And I think that has changed. We never used to do that. That's something new. So I think there is a gradual drip of good initiatives, but they will take an awful long time to feed through. But that's one thing the county's doing.
The other quick statistic, in terms of incentives, I think there's estimates that about 30% of farmers or farmland will go into some sort of scheme. So again, you've got to have the regulation, and I'm afraid it does come back to government, you know, better regulation.
It should be said, I mean, an awful lot of us who survey meet farmers all the time, and I think probably they're even some better education and training for us as surveyors to know what to be able to tell the farmers, other than please don't cut down that, might also help, because we are out there on the ground and you know, meeting farmers 4 times a year or however many times you do your surveys. Right, I know it's very tempting to take questions from the floor, but we have so many questions. This is certainly something we will take under advisement and may well do in... Go. Okay.
Yeah, so
okay.
That's a really good point.
That's a point well made. Let me move on, because we've got more topics to cover before we wind up. Caroline James, how do we avoid putting our head in the sand in response to the overwhelming bad news and appalling leadership on environmental issues in this country? It's overwhelming. I mean, I think we all sympathise with that sentiment. Chris?
I don't sympathise with it at all.
Oh, no. Go on.
Winning is not giving up. In our lifetimes, we're not going to achieve what we need to do. Debbie's not going to get the funding to do the things that she wants to do, because even if she got X amount of funding, she'd find more things to do. That's the nature of the scale of recovery that we need to implement. So from our point of view, the only way to keep going is just not to give up. And as I said before, I think you've got to be, you've got to channel all of that negativity into something positive. So, I was an angry young man, I'm an angry old man, but I learned a long time ago that I've got to use that anger creatively. There's no point in screaming and shouting. You've got to find a positive response to that anger. And that means you've got to think, you've got to, be considered, and you've got to be creative. But the key thing that we've all got to realise, and we've touched upon this before, is that we are all capable of empowering ourselves to make a difference. And that just goes back to those cards, your bank cards in your wallet, and the choices that you'll make when you go shopping on the way home. You are powerful. Collectively, we are more powerful than they are. If we exercise that power, we can make that difference. Our problem is, as Debbie's pointed out, we need 25% of us to do that, and we need to do it pretty quickly. And that's why I think we need to be acting more urgently, more broadly, and more effectively.
What about the environmental NGOs? Are they doing enough? Are they acting in a coordinated and strategic way to bring about change?
Well, even if they were, I would say no, because that would be a means of encouraging them to do more. So, are they doing enough? Look, this goes back to the point I was about to make at the beginning, and that is that let's just, pick upon the Hampshire Wildlife Trust since Debbie's here. Debbie is running essentially a conservation business. That business needs to be secure in order to meet its key targets. It has staff it needs to employ, it needs to be able to run those nature reserves and so on and so forth. That means that that business is encumbered by processes, which means that it can't be as reactive as people like myself would sometimes like it to be. Yeah. I'm an individual. I can make a decision on an afternoon after 3 phone calls. I chat with Andy, I chat with other people that I would take advice from, and then I can make an instant decision. What's frustrating people at the moment is that I would argue that collectively, and I'm not talking about the Hampshire Wildlife Trust here, because, and I'm not just saying that because Debbie's here and she's a mate, but she is one of the exceptional CEOs of the Wildlife Trust. Debbie is pulling her weight and doing what she needs to do. There are others, I would say, who are not meeting their target. And the one thing that I think is breeding frustration is the speed of action. And that is the key thing. I think there is a general groundswell now where people want our NGOs to act more quickly and more forcefully. But as I say, we do have to sympathise that, you can't throw all of your eggs out of the basket and then allow your nature reserve network to go to hell in a handcart next year because you've got no money. And so we have to sympathise with that. But yeah, do we need more action? Yeah, I think we do. And I think that, we need more... Look, we need more members on the street, if you like. And on the street, I mean by taking part in proactive protest. And proactive protest is not paint, it's not gluing yourself to something, it's not even standing on a street corner with a placard. It's getting that card out, ripping it up, and banking with Triodos.
Martin, okay. we are in an election year. Martin Holmes raises the question of both political parties wanting to boost house building and streamline planning. Where do we start? Chris, I mean, I so understand where they're coming from, but equally, this is not pushing in the right direction for us at the moment, is it?
No, it isn't. And again, we've been conned with the whole Brexit thing, and it's up to us to push back. And by us, I mean the conservation fraternity. So collectively, we have an enormous voice in the UK. There are X million members of the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, and everyone else, plus us as concerned individuals, even if you're not signed up. The fact of the matter is we are in a position of making a decision when we go to an election. Prior to that, we should be writing to our MPs and any potential candidates and telling them what we expect of them if we elect them to represent us. And I think that one of the problems we've got, is that our MPs don't see themselves as there to represent us anymore. They're not public servants, and equally they're not accountable. It's time for us to hold them to account, and that's where we need to take control.
Andy, you've worked in the industry, so to speak, for quite a long time. Very long time. Very long time. I was being polite. I thought quiet was all right. Do you feel the lack of a sort of long-term strategy? You know, that it is 5 years and then we turn left, right, centre, whatever else it is, so that there's a lack of consistency, because all these problems we're talking about aren't going to go away in 5 years. They're not going to go away in 20 or 30 years.
Personally, I think that's the fundamental thing about, I think the political system in this country is outdated, and it only looks 5 years. Look at the problems we're facing with sewage and water. He wants 25, 30, 40-year investment into that. You want a longer future. You can't look at it in a 5-year period. You're not going to solve the problems that we're facing out there at the moment in a 5-year period. So I think we need a fundamental change in how we look at those things.
Andrew Joy raises a question about the Labour Party talking about an ambitious right to roam policy. Pete, are you looking forward to a right to roam all over?
Well, I'll have a stab first of all, but Debbie has just said she's keen to answer this one. So,
okay.
I mean, it's interesting that, in some ways, the same discussion came up around the King Charles Path, the coastal path, and the impact that is potentially going to have on wildlife and wildlife sites. I think they've had to take that into account, certain sites. I'm not saying it's 100% right, and they've done a great job everywhere, but if you're going to have a major right to roam policy, as perhaps you've got in the New Forest, you look at the New Forest, people can go anywhere in the New Forest, and we've already talked about the impacts of that with dogs and people disturbing the wildlife in the forest. So, yeah, if you're going to do it, you need to build safeguards into it and make sure that, you know, this right is something that you need to respect. You know, if you're going to go into large areas that currently you don't have access to, you've got to think about what's currently there in the way of wildlife and other things as well. You know. Debbie.
So, controversially, I think actually a right to roam policy could be, if done well, transformational for our wildlife. Because if you think about it, and I said this earlier, 80% of open access land at the moment has a wildlife designation. The Crow Act concentrated open access land onto nature reserves. But if you look across England, only 8% of our land is open. 50% of our land is owned by 1% of the population. So you've got huge areas of land that no one can go in, that frankly probably aren't as good for wildlife as the places that people can go in. So I think it's about dilution. I think it's about opening up opportunities for people to get out and experience the countryside and taking the pressure off. Because the thing is, we've already got Crow Act. So adding right to roam isn't going to make that worse. And actually, the people that are working on that policy at the moment are looking at building in really good, strong safeguards. So you flip it on its head. So you, instead of having open areas, you know, most of it's closed with a few open areas, you have it on the other way around. Most of it's open with a few closed areas. And the reasons for closing areas might well be wildlife. So actually, it could be better.
So what kind of policy change would you like to see? I mean, because is this a well-informed decision, or is this something by the Labour Party? Do they think, or is this something they think will appeal to lots of people without actually having had advice from people like, you know, the people around? Where are you? Yeah, these are the people who should be telling you what to do.
I mean, it needs to be, if it's going to happen, it needs to be very well informed by people that understand. And actually there's a very good active group working on this right now, working with all of the NGOs to make sure that if it does come about, it's done properly.
So one of the unintended consequences of it might be that if people are allowed to roam in large parts of the countryside, which they're currently not allowed to roam, they'll see just how rubbish it is.
Yeah.
And actually, if most people are recreating in the New Forest or walking on the Seawall at Lymington, they think, actually, there's nothing much to worry about here. There's lots of wildlife, because that, as you say, they've been forced onto these already designated sites. If they end up them walking through an arable desert in the centre of Hampshire for a few hours, they'll think, maybe something is wrong here. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Caroline French says 4% of UK consumers are vegan, 7% are vegetarian. If that number rose to a combined 50%, what impact would it have on our countryside and wildlife? Chris?
Enormous. I just cast your mind back to the graphic that Debbie showed, and it was the map in the top right-hand corner. When you look at the amount of land area that is given over to meat, dairy and sheep. We know the UN, the Climate Change Committee, our health advisors have all told us that we need to eat less meat for our health, for animal welfare reasons, and critically for the environment. The figures about how much carbon is put into the atmosphere are ambiguous. They range between 11 and 70% of emissions, so clearly it's somewhere in between. But we know that that's an absolute given. And again, we don't have to all become vegan. What we have to do is eat less meat of a higher quality. And that means, and this goes back to the lady's very critical point, I'm glad you mentioned this, was supermarket pricing. Again, it's difficult to, wield the stick at farmers when we're giving them no support in our supermarkets whatsoever. And we were talking about deer earlier and the fact that it's the best organic meat that we've got in the country. It's been roaming free. If it has a properly executed demise, it's had the best possible life. But you don't find that in your supermarket. What you find is some ghastly produce which has come all the way from New Zealand with high carbon footprint, where we've got no control over animal welfare standards, and your supermarkets are selling it cheaper to price our farmers out of business. And that's not acceptable. But I'm not banging on here as a vegan. I'm just telling you the scientific facts. We've got to eat less meat. And that Debbie's map told the whole story when you looked at it. The vast amount of land that's given over to inefficient food production. Inefficient because basically we're feeding animals food we could eat ourselves.
Question from Nikki Court. Okay. If we could get government funds to help recover one species in particular, which bird species would you choose? Andy, where are you going?
Ooh, I'm not an advocate of that approach, if I'm being honest with you.
Okay.
I think our wildlife crisis is so extreme that we need bigger, more cohesive, wildlife-friendly policies for all our businesses, our farming, our forestry and our water-based activities. It's not about a species, it's looking at the
So you're
the
not
whole.
a huge fan of the white-tailed eagle, the magnificent beast soaring over the Hampshire countryside?
It has its place, but I'd rather not pick out a bird species to say I would like to see that here. I'd rather we fixed the other problems first.
Would you be in favour of recovering anything in particular?
Well, I was just thinking that if you'd have asked me and Andy that question when we were teenagers, we might have said goshawks.
And lo and behold, yeah.
Careful what you wish for.
Pete, what would you like to see gracing your reserve?
As in something that isn't there.
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
moment.
which is not there at the moment. Which
That's a good. Maybe purple heron.
Yeah. The president of the Purple Heron Fan Club here. Absolutely. Debbie, where are you going?
Swifts. Mandate Swift bricks now.
Yeah. Right. Interesting question. Nigel Matthews asks, HOS is one of the largest and most active county ornithological societies in the UK. What one thing do you think we should do more of, do better, or start doing so we can lead the way and make a difference? Christopher, President.
Raise our voices. Again, we've come here today with a sense of commonality. What's made you give up your day, your Saturday, other than you've been hiding from the rain? What's made you come to this place? It's because we all share a passion and we have a desire to, improve the health of our landscape and everything that lives in it. So I think we have to put our differences aside. I've got no foxes. But I've got Andy's curlews. We're never going to fall out of that about that in a million years, because you've got to see the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is, it's not Hampshire and it's not birds. It's the fact that we are in deep, deep global trouble. And I think, therefore, when it comes to addressing those bigger picture issues, they are sometimes political and they are sometimes confrontational and they are difficult. But if we don't stand up now, then I think we're in trouble. So, look, you may not be fans of Just Stop Oil, okay? You may not be fans of their method, but you have to sympathise with their motives. They've read the science. They are saying that if we don't cut back on fossil fuels and transition to renewable energies, we're doomed. And you know that's true too. So you don't, as I said before, you don't have to glue yourself. You don't have to stand in the street. You don't have to use their methods. But if you do need to stand alongside that activism at the level that you are comfortable with. And we have the strength here as a community of concerned people to make that difference. I'll just go back for it for the third time, because I don't want anyone to be not on it tomorrow morning. Bank ethically. It's the single biggest thing you could do, and it's so easy. There's no confrontation, no glue, no paint, no risk of arrest. unless you don't do it.
I mean, the motivation for most people here in this hall are those moments of joy you get, with those quiet moments where you're just at one with nature. Is there a particular moment in this year that you think, oh, God, that was great?
I think there are many moments, but perhaps those are the things which give the reassurance. But what stimulate me, I mean, I'm working under a shadow of guilt. You know, and I think many people here, you know, we saw what Debbie's presentation, a lot of those declines have happened on our watch. And it's very clear that we haven't done enough, rapidly enough, to address those declines. And look, I look at the audience, I'm very pleased to see young people here today, but there's still quite a lot of grey beards out there, or grey hair. And as a consequence of that, we've got less time to make that difference. And I think one of the key things is, as I mentioned earlier, is building a firm foundation to make sure that future generations can do what we haven't done properly.
Well done. Excellent. Well, thank you so much to our panel. A really vigorous and informative and passionate debate, and I hope you found it useful and inspiring. Plenty of things, I think, to take forward, not least changing your bank. But anyway, so thank you very much indeed.